Yeah, that's fine. Let's record now. I got the recording going, so take it away.
Sounds good. So obviously, I'm involved in two startups. One is New Mix Materials that came out of Northwestern's Nuvention Energy, focused primarily on recovering metals of value from liquid-based sources. And I'm also the president and chief technology officer of another company called Metcovery. And we use high temperature metallurgical processes, so an induction furnace and melting, to recover metals of interest from solid waste sources. Those sources could be byproducts from the non-ferrous foundry industry. They could be mine tailings. They could be hazardous materials that need to be cleaned up. There's a whole host of potential opportunities there. And the primary idea behind a student-led project for Metcovery specifically is that we're really positioning ourselves in the market as high temperature chemistry experts or niche market smelting. So we're basically performing similar processes overall to what is done at scale in industry, but we're doing it on a niche market scale. So we want to look at ourselves as bringing the refinery to the customer as opposed to the customer's material to the refinery. So on the one hand, you have our non-ferrous industry business. So in the non-ferrous, non-iron, primarily copper-based foundry world, when you go to make brass for pipe fittings or bronze for aircraft landing gear bushings, when you're melting that metal, between 3 to 5% of it gets oxidized in contact with the environment and becomes a slag or a dross. At that point, it's more like a rock than it is a metal. It floats to the surface and we were able to skim it off. That's normal foundry business. Every foundry does that. Right now, the entire foundry industry takes those oxide byproducts and they collect them and then they sell them to a scrap dealer for 40 to 50 cents on the dollar, maybe. That scrap dealer then turns around and it goes through a number of different middlemen until it finally winds its way up overseas. It's always international. There are no domestic refiners for these copper-based materials. So it's either Canada, Mexico, or Europe. And so basically, all of these smaller domestic manufacturing foundries that pride themselves on being domestic manufacturing, they're shipping a considerable, non-negligible fraction of their value. They're just shipping it overseas. And so we have a process that can take those oxide byproducts and we melt them down. We melt the rocks in a furnace and we actually can reduce those oxides back into meltable metal. So it comes out of the furnace pre-alloyed with all the alloying additions that the original producer had put in, and it's ready to go right back into their supply chain. One of the nicest things, one of the best things, if you have a brass alloy, common brass alloy, 70% copper, 30% zinc. If you go to sell that dross, that byproduct to a slag dealer, scrap dealer, they will give you credit for the copper in your metal only, which is fine in a brass alloy where the other metal is zinc, which drags the aggregate value down overall. The problem comes in when you want to create a niche market alloy. Like there's an alloy I'm working with right now. It's a copper nickel aluminum alloy. It's got upwards of 17% nickel and 2% cobalt. Both elements very expensive and considerably closer to that critical mineral supply chain. So not easy to get. If you were to sell that material off, you would get your value for your copper at 50% of your copper back, but you'd lose all that value for the nickel and the cobalt and whatever else you wanted in there. Our process returns all of that value back to the original producer. So that's kind of the bread and butter business of our day-to-day. And then separately, looking in a slightly different direction, say you pick up a property in Colorado, you go buy a place in the mountains and you discover an old gold mine on your property and there's a big pile of tailings, the waste from the gold mine. This gold mine operated in, say 1920, when technology and processes hadn't really caught up to where they are now. So you have that pile on your property tested, and it comes out as having, say, 2 ounces of gold per ton of material. That's a non-negligible amount of gold. Typical gold mines nowadays are starting off looking at ore that's about half an ounce of gold per ton of ore. So there's non-negligible value. It's increased 4 times higher value than a traditional gold mine. However, you only have, say, 100 tons or even 1,000 tons of this material on your property. You will not be able to extract that. You will not find anybody out there to extract that gold. And if you switch the conversation from gold to platinum group elements, it becomes even more difficult. There really is not anyone out there in that niche market smelting capacity that's able to help these people who have 100 to 1,000 tons of random material. There's nobody out there to process it for them. And it turns out that our induction melting furnace technology suite, platform, if you will, is particularly adept at extracting large amounts of precious values from these traditionally considered waste sources. It can even extract higher than normal values from regular ore. So higher values than a traditional miner smelter would be able to extract. So it's really a two-pronged business approach. And the biggest thing that we really need help with is market analysis and customer discovery and market development. On the one hand, on the brass side of things, identifying foundries that fit the criteria, not so small that they don't have use for our services, not so large that they already have all this stuff built into their supply chain already. And then what types of alloys, how much total value is there out there in the market to be had by a company in our position? What's the total accessible market? I have a general idea, but putting specifics to it would be extraordinarily helpful. On top of that, on the precious metal side of things, analyzing the landscape literally and figuratively for identifying potential sites of interest. That may include looking at United States Geological Survey data to identify geologic regions that are primed, if you will, or going through the United States Mine Legacy Management System to identify specifically closed mine sites that may offer extra value. But really, it comes down to taking this innovative process concept and expanding it out to really do a deep dive into what is our total accessible market.